So welcome back again to our study of Paul's letter to the Philippians. We're almost done. As you can see, after this chunk of verses here, there's about two more in the final greetings, and that's it for our study. So if you missed any of these sermons on this letter or on this book, we have most of the sermon videos on YouTube. They are all archived there. Unfortunately, the past few weeks have yet to be uploaded there, so you can still watch them on our Facebook page. So they're still in the Facebook. Every Sunday that we broadcast something, it stays on Facebook, and it stays there pretty much forever. So whatever's not on YouTube, whatever's not on our website will be on Facebook. So again, we're almost at the end of this letter. Paul's exhortation to his friends at Philippi. This morning, we come to one of the most recognizable, and I would say one of the most memorized, one of the most famously used verses in all of the Bible. Okay, and you know which verse I'm talking about. In fact, I googled top 10 most quotable and most popular verses, and this verse in Philippians 4:13 is always on that list. It's always top 10 most quotable, most popular verses. Philippians 4:13. What does Philippians 4:13 say? I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. Now, sadly, for many people, the reason why they like this verse so much is because of misinterpretation and the selfish misunderstanding, I would say, and ignorance when it comes to God's provision, because that's what this verse is about. It's about the provision of God. So a lot of people like it because they don't understand how God's provision works and what it is about. Okay? So now as we study this verse, we're going to study it the way we study all the verses that we've studied so far, which is in context. Okay? And again, if you've been to this church long enough, you know that I'm big on context. We should be when it comes to reading the Bible. And we're going to take a look at this verse in context. First, in the context which Paul wrote this verse in. Well, not first, but we're going to take a look at it in the context that Paul wrote this verse in, and the theme that is prevalent within this context in these chunks, in this chunk of verses here in verses 10 to 20. And when you look at this context, and if you have read it, and I hope you have to prepare for this morning's message, I think, and the way I see it, is that the main context of verses 10 to 20 is I named it, or I coined the title, the cycle of contentment. Okay, the cycle of contentment. If you read this, maybe you won't see the cycle yet, and hopefully that's my job to kind of show you that what the cycle of contentment is based on these verses. But as far as the context in which 4:13 is found, I think this is the context, a cycle of contentment. Now, before we get there, let's look at the bigger context first. So let's zoom out of 4:13 all the way out to chapter 4. Okay, the whole of chapter 4. That's the bigger picture in which verse 13 is found, right? So if you can still remember, most of chapter 4 was written by Paul as an encouragement for the brothers and sisters in Philippi, encouraging them to be what? Or for what? Paul is encouraging them to stay united in love for the work of the gospel, even in the midst of challenges that were both inside and outside of the church. So throughout the whole letter, from 1 to 4, Paul has been talking about there's opposition to the gospel. There's challenges outside of the church. In fact, he wrote this in prison. That's part of the challenge. But there's also challenges inside the church that he talks about here in chapter 4. So that's a bigger context. So despite all the challenges, he's encouraging the Philippian believers to continue to be united in love, to continue the work of the gospel. In chapter 4, if you go back to verses 2 to 9, the main goal of Paul in these verses is to resolve an disagreement, internal issue between two of the leaders in the church. How does he do this? By encouraging them to rejoice in the Lord always. So that's the first thing that Paul, prescribes here as a resolution for disagreements is to rejoice in the Lord always. Why does he do that? What's the purpose of rejoicing in the Lord? Because when you do it, when you're able to do that by faith, uh, it will leave its mark on you, right? Remember we talked about this, the marks of joy that is left on a believer who is able to rejoice in the Lord always by faith. What are those marks? One of those marks is that that believer will have the peace of God. And again, if you want to learn or if you want to review what I said about these things, I'm not going to say much about it right now because it's just review. You can watch the archive videos. Okay. So Paul's prescription for the disagreement was to first rejoice in the Lord always, and then in rejoicing in the Lord always by faith, it will leave a mark in the life of the believer. One of those marks include the peace of God, which leads to having a mind of peace, or the mind of peace. And with that, this joy in the hearts will leave a mark, leading to a life lived with a mind of peace that is guarded by God Himself through the Holy Spirit. And then through this mind of peace, believers will be able to overcome any challenges that may stand in their way and remain united as they work side by side for the advancement of the gospel in Philippi. So all of these things that Paul laid out in the first half of the chapter 4 is for that. It's for unity, whether it be to rejoice and to have marks of joy, to have the mind of peace. It's for the unity that they're supposed to have as believers and fellow workers in the gospel. Why do they need unity? They need it so that they can continue the work of the gospel. So now when you look at that context, now you zoom into verses 10 and 20, this is the context where verses 10 and 20 is found. When you look at 10 and 20, 10 to 20, these verses, they talk about how the Philippian believers have supported or partnered with Paul, right, in their giving as they work side by side for the advancement of the gospel. So again, going with the theme of the first half of the verse or of the chapter, 10 to 20 talks about the same thing. This time, instead of unity within the Philippian church, it talks about unity with Paul, partnership with Paul, to support Paul in his work or in the work of the gospel by their giving. So verses 10 to 20 is about how God used the Philippians to provide for Paul's needs, and how their participation and partnership with Paul was actually God's work in and through them, right? So that both the Philippians and Paul may what? May continue in unity as they work together for the advancement of the gospel where God has placed them. Right? At this point, Paul and the Philippian believers were separated by like 1,300 kilometers, right? Paul is in Rome and the Philippians are in Philippi. But because of the gospel and because of their faith, they still are united. Even though they're separated, they're still united in the work of advancing the gospel. And that's what 10 and 20, or verses 10 to 20 is talking about. How the Philippian believers are doing that. How are they being united? Through their support, through their giving. When it comes to, meeting Paul's needs. And it's all God's work in the end, right? So that's the greater context in which verses 10 to 20 are found. Okay? Now let's zoom in to the context or Paul's exhortation in verses 10 to 20. So when you look at verses 10 to 20, I don't know about you, but my Bible, ESV, has these titles. At the beginning of before verse 10 starts, there's a title. I don't usually look at titles that the biblical interpreters or those of theologians put for these chunks of verses, such as verses 10 to 20. But in this case, I think that the title placed for this chunk of verses is very useful and accurate. So again, if you have your ESV, if you turn to verse 10, Philippians 4, verse 10, you'll see a title on the top of it, right? The title says God's Provision in ESV. Okay? I'll give you a couple of minutes to kind of look at that. So hopefully you see that God's provision. If you have a King James version or a New King James version or a New American Standard version or an NIV, if you look at those versions, the title given to this group of verses is "Thanks for the Gifts." That's the title. If you check those versions, right? Thanks for the gifts. So which one is more accurate? Why are they different? Well, let's talk about why they're the same first. Both are correct in that these verses do contain God's provision through the gifts of the Philippian believers. So, yes, it is the Philippian believers or through the Philippian believers' gifts that Paul's needs were met, but ultimately it was God's provision for those gifts. That's why Paul received those gifts. So again, which title is more accurate? I think that the ESV style is more accurate, obviously. I don't think that these verses talk about Paul's gratitude to the Philippians for their generosity and help. I don't see it in reading it. I don't see Paul expressing gratitude to the Philippian believers because of the help that they sent him. Right? On the other hand, I do think that these verses contain more of an account, more of an explanation or an exhortation that the contentment coming from God is a cycle that enabled the Philippians to be generous givers so that Paul may receive the help he needed in order for both of them to continue the work of the gospel. Okay? So if you read the scriptures, God always uses somebody in order to accomplish his means. Okay? Somebody or something sometimes. Back in Noah's days, he used a dove to tell Noah that the water has receded. So he does. He always uses something or someone in order to get his means to his people. In this case, he's blessed the Philippian believers in order to meet Paul's needs. Right? And I think that's what is being talked about here in verses 10 to 20. And I call it a cycle because the cycle of contentment in this context begins with God. Okay? It begins with God and flows to the giver, who are the Philippians, and then through the generosity. And I'm trying hard not to get ahead of myself, but generosity comes from contentment as well. Okay, that's why I'm saying this is a cycle. Okay, so that cycle of contentment begins with God, flows to the giver. Okay, and the giver, the Philippians, and then through their generosity, that blessing or that provision flows to the one who is in need. Okay, in this case, it's Paul. And then at the end, both the giver and the one in need, because they got what they wanted or needed, they give praise and worship to God. So it goes back to God. And then God again provides for the need of those who he's going to use in order to, as channels of blessing to those who are in need. And then the needy get what they need, and they both praise God at the end. That's the cycle that I see here. Now, obviously, we're going to unpack that some more. But for right now, that's what I want you to see. That's where we're going here. That's why I entitled this the cycle of contentment, right? And again, if you look at it, if you look at the end of verse 20, the verse 20 at the end, what does it say? It says, "To our God and Father be glory forever and ever. Amen." That's how Paul ends this chunk of verses. That's why I don't think that this is a verse of thanksgiving for the gifts of the Philippians. It's not. It's an account. It's an exhortation. You can say a sermon on the cycle of contentment that ends with God getting the glory forever and ever. Amen? Because really it starts and ends with God. So even though the Philippians were used to provide for Paul's needs, what enabled them to give and to give out of their poverty. And again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but these are the things that we ought to think about as we start taking up these verses. Okay? So that's the context of verses 10 to 20. Okay? So when you look at the title, if it says thanks for their gifts, It's kind of right, but I think God's provision is more accurate. So I think that's the context that we're working in, the bigger context that we're working in anyway, in verses 10 to 20. So we zoomed in. So first we started from the chapter context, then we zoomed into the context in which verse 10 to 20 is in. Then we zoomed in on the actual context of verses 10 and 20. Now we're going to zoom in a little bit more so that we can get the context in which Philippians 4:13 is found. So for that, we're going to have to take this verse by verse. So now we're going to go through it verse by verse, starting from verse 10. You guys ready? I hope so. So verse 10. I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. If you look at the translation in the New King James, that was the ESV that we showed you. In the New King James Version or translation, it says this, but I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last your care for me has flourished again, though you surely did care, but you lacked opportunity. I'm going to work off that verse because there's a more emphasis on what I'm trying to point out in that verse. So if you just read that plainly, doesn't matter from ESV or from New King James. It seems like what Paul is doing here is he's trying to communicate to the Philippians that he was filled with joy, that they were able to resume their support for him, and that he understands why that support didn't come for a while. So what happens was the Philippians at the start of Paul's ministry, they started supporting him and then it stopped, right? And after a while, who knows what that while is? I think it's years. After a while, it stopped and then it resumed. It started again. So when you read that verse, you can see it from that verse, right? But when the opportunity came, so even though it stopped for a while, when the opportunity came, namely in the presence or in the volunteer, when Epaphroditus volunteered, the Philippians sent Paul their help again. Okay, that's what he's trying to say here. And when he talks about help, he's talking about financial help, right? So that's what it looks like Paul is trying to say here. But what is he trying to show us here in this verse? Okay, especially in light of the verses that are coming next. I think that what Paul is trying to show us in this verse is that part of a believer's maturity is to be able to think ahead before saying something. Think before you speak, and make sure that your words don't get misunderstood in any way that could lead to disagreement. Okay, how did I see that, or where do I see that in this verse? Let me explain. Okay, if you read the first part of verse 10 again, first part of verse 10 says, "I rejoice in the Lord greatly," or in New King James, "I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last your care for me has flourished again." If you read that part, it could imply, or some people could read that part and understand it as, the Philippians stopped caring for Paul for a period of time, and now at last started sending him money again. Right? You could read it that way. Right? So yes, you stopped caring for me, but at last now at last, you started sending me money again. So some could read it that way, and some could, some could say, or read it as if Paul was saying, finally, you decided to help me again. So if you're going to read it that way, you can read it that way as well, right? Finally, you started caring for me again, or started to help me again. So when you read that, the implication is that Paul is really, he's not really happy that The Philippians have been partnering with him this whole time, but he was kind of frustrated when they stopped. And so now when they started again, he's kind of sarcastic in a way and saying, well, you know what? Finally, you started caring for me or started helping me again. So it could lead somebody to think that, well, Paul's only care for the Philippians is their giving, is their financial help. That's all he cares about here in this verse, right? It's all about the giving. It's all about the help that the Philippians are giving him. So when you think about it, you read about it that way, you read it that way, it'll sound the very first part of verse 10 seems sarcastic, right? When he says, "But I rejoice," he's like saying, "Oh, finally! Like where have you been all this time? Now that you have started again, I rejoice. Great. Now, thank you again for supporting me." Um, and people, like, I mean, I'm not saying you or, or anybody listening here, but from Paul's perspective, somebody could have taken that sentence in the first part of verse 10 the wrong way. And that's why he takes, these next few verses as time to explain, or his opportunity to explain to them. That's not what I meant by that. That's not why I said what I said. That's not what I mean by that, right? Because again, he could sound sarcastic to some. He could sound like all he wanted was money from the Philippians to some, and that's all he's after. All he wants is them sending him money. But that's not what Paul means, and that's why he takes the next few verses to kind of prove that, right? But what can we learn from that? Just that one part, that one phrase or that one sentence in the first part of verse 10. What could we learn from that? What we could learn, I think, is that we should do the same. So Paul obviously here has thought about what he wanted to say, even though, that first part, somebody could take it either positive or negative. The rest of the verses that he used, he's already thought about. So the rest of the verses, as we read them, you'll see that he's trying to explain himself, that I'm not after your money only. Really, I'm not after your money at all. If you read the rest of the verses, that's why Paul takes this whole 19 verses, or sorry, not 19, but 10 verses in order to explain himself, because some could have misunderstood that first sentence he said in verse 10. So again, what can we learn from that? I think what we can learn from that is what I said earlier. We should think before we speak. We should have the mind of Christ in humility when we're communicating to others. Not because you understand it in your head doesn't mean it doesn't mean that it's going to land wrong on somebody. It could. Not because in your head it's all good doesn't mean that it's going to be all good when you say it to somebody. So you got to be careful with how you say stuff, even though it might sound good to you. Some people might take it the wrong way. And I think that's the lesson that we need to learn here, that we need to consider how what we're about to say is going to affect the person or the people that we're talking to. And I think this goes for verbal communication. This also goes for sending emails or text messages or however we communicate nowadays. You got to think about how that person is going to receive or is going to take whatever message it is that you're sending them, because sometimes it could go sideways. There could be a misunderstanding. I've experienced that, by the way. So that's why you have to make sure that you don't only think about yourself and what you want to say. Think about how it's going to affect others. Consider how it's going to affect others. And again, that's the same mind that Paul has been talking about in chapter 2. Right? Having the mind of Christ, having the humility to do that when it comes to communicating with others. And that's what Paul did in verse 10. And the second part, since the first part of verse 10 could have been misunderstood or has the potential to be misunderstood, even though Paul meant well, Paul uses the last part of verse 10 along with verses 11 to 13 in order to make what he's trying to say crystal clear. So that's why 10b, 11, and 13 Paul used to clarify what he's trying to say in verse 10 so that there would be no misunderstanding. Right? No disagreements, no misunderstanding. So let's read the next part of verse 10 all the way to 13. So 10b says, "You were indeed concerned for me." Why would he say that? Because he thought the first part of verse 10 could be misunderstood. So now he's clarifying. "You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity." Right? Not that I am speaking of being in need, and this is the continuation of his clarification. Not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I'm to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So as you can see, last part of verse 10, clarification for the first part. Right? So Paul, if you did read the first part of verse 10 as, oh man, all this guy wants is money. He doesn't care about the Philippians. In the last part of verse 10, he says what? Paul saying in the last part of verse 10, Paul is saying to the Philippians that that they did not care for, or sorry, that they did care for him. Right? I don't mean when you read the first part of verse 10 that you didn't care for me. That's why in the last part of verse 10 he says, yes, you did care for me. You just didn't have what? The opportunity. So if some people read the first part of verse 10 and says, oh, what happened? The Philippians stopped caring for Paul? The Philippians stopped helping Paul? Paul clarifies that in the second part of verse 10. No, they didn't stop. They always wanted to help. They have never stopped caring for me. They just didn't have the opportunity. What does that mean? Here, I think Paul is showing us what it looks like to have the heart of a cheerful giver, right? So him saying to the Philippians, they never stopped caring for me. They've always wanted to help. In the last part of verse 10, that's what he's saying. They've always wanted to help. They just didn't have the opportunity. He's telling us, no, these guys are cheerful givers. I know them. They've been helping me from the start of my ministry, right? They are cheerful givers. When we talk about giving, in the eyes of God, in the eyes of Jesus, giving should never be forced. It shouldn't be a begrudging kind of giving or a giving that is done out of duty. That's not true biblical giving. Biblical Christian giving is done for the joy of being able to give. Right? I can't see your hands, but who here finds joy in just giving or being able to give? I'm sure a lot of us do, right? That's the joy that Paul is showing here, that he's showing that the Philippians never stopped caring. In fact, they've always wanted to give. Just didn't have the opportunity. Right? That's what biblical Christian giving is all about. It's giving for the joy of being able to give and through faith, being able to give through faith in God to provide in order for us to give again and receive joy. So if you're a cheerful giver, you're not just cheerful because you can give, but you're cheerful for the fact that God enabled you to give. And that's where the faith aspect comes in. Right? That's what it means to be a cheerful giver. In fact, this last Wednesday, we were talking about this. I asked a question on Wednesday to those who were attending. I asked this question: can you actually give on Wednesday it was, can you actually do acts of love? Acts of love without getting anything in return. That was the question I posted to uh, the Wednesday prayer group. Can you give without getting anything in return? I know the Bible tells us when you give and without expecting anything to come back or to be paid back to you, right? But can you actually do that? Can you actually give and not get anything back? Uh, and again, I hope I can see your hands. Who says yes? If you can raise your hands, who says yes, you can give without getting anything back? Or who says no, you can't. You can never give without getting anything back, because every time you give, you get something back. Um, to answer that question, let's go to Luke 14. This is also the same verse we used on Wednesday, Luke 14, 12 to 14. He said also to the man who had invited him, when you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and be repaid. But when you give, but when you give a feast, invite the poor, invite the crippled, the blind, the lame, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. So what's the answer to our question? Can you give without getting anything in return? That passage that we just read seems to say that, yeah, you can. You can give without getting anything in return if you give to people who cannot pay you back. Right? That's what that passage says. Don't give to those who can pay you back. Give to the poor, the blind, the lame, the crippled. Give to them because they can't pay you back. So is it possible to give without getting anything in return? It looks like it, right? But look at the end of the parable in verse 14. Look at the end. Jesus says that when you give to those who cannot repay you, you will be, it says there, you will be blessed. How and why? And the end of verse 14 says, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. That means that even if you give to those who cannot repay you, God will repay you. So can you ever give without getting anything in return? I don't think so. If you give cheerfully, if you give by faith, okay, not begrudging giving. If you give by faith, you can never do it without getting anything in return, because God himself will pay you. And it says in the parable that God will repay at the resurrection of the just. In other words, when Christ returns, right? So for some people, okay, that's good enough for me. God will pay me then, but right now I'm broke. What's gonna happen to me right now? Does God only repay at the resurrection of the just? I don't think so. Mark 10, 28 to 30. Let's read it. Peter began to say to him, see, we have left everything and followed you. Jesus said, truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mothers or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this time, houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. So, I could do a whole sermon on just those two verses alone. But what I want you to focus on is that does God only give at the end, at the resurrection of the just? That's when he repays everybody? No. Jesus said you will receive 100-fold now in this time. Right? In this time. So you will be getting blessings. Now, those blessings could be either intrinsic or they could be extrinsic. What am I talking about? They could be external blessings. They could be a job. They could be good health. They could be, I don't know, like a child for some of us who's praying for one. It could be all that. Those are the external blessings that Christ is talking about here, and even because he talks about houses and brothers and children and lands, right? Or it could also be intrinsic. When I talk about intrinsic, it's a feeling. It's the joy that you get from giving. So again, go back to our question: can you actually give? Can you do acts of love without getting anything in return? You can't. If you're giving out of a cheerful heart, if you're giving out of faith, we can never give without getting anything in return. Why? Because God will always repay. Right? And listen, I don't know if you heard this before, but you cannot outgive God. Okay? You cannot say to God, there you go, there you go, God, I'm done. You don't have to give me anything anymore. I've already given you all that I have. Don't give me anything. I don't need anything from you. Then you'll die. Right? Because even the breath that you're breathing right now, it's a gift from God. So we can never outgive God. And I think that's what, when you look at what Paul says here in Philippians 10, especially the last part of verse 10, when he says, you were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. That's what Paul is pointing to. The heart, the cheerful heart of the Philippians when it comes to giving. They're givers who are just waiting for the opportunity to give. You know what I'm saying? They're always ready to give. Just give them the opportunity, they'll give. You know, for some of us, opportunity is right in front of our face sometimes. Offering plate comes. That's the opportunity. Do you give? Yeah, maybe next week. I got to pay my bills. Or maybe next week I got to buy a new purse. Or maybe next week, when I have overtime. That's cheerful giving, having the heart of a giver, means that you're actually looking for opportunities to give. And then when the opportunity comes, you give. Some of us are saying, let me take care of all my debts first, and then I'll give. Then I'll do that. No, that's not what God's telling us here. When the opportunity comes, these guys, these Philippians, they gave out of their poverty. Right? Out of their poverty. What else can you give if you're already poor? But they did. They gave out of their poverty. They didn't say, let us pay our debts first and then we'll give. No. And that's what God, and that's what Paul, God through Paul is showing us here. That even though the Philippians stopped supporting him, it's not because they didn't want to. It's not because they ran out of funds, or they just finding all kinds of excuses not to help him. But no, when the opportunity came, they were giving again. They were supporting him again. And that's why I think that's what Paul is showing us here in the last part of verse 10, that the Philippians were cheerful givers. So if ever you read, this is what Paul is saying, if ever you read the first part of verse 10 wrong, and you think that I'm only after them for their money, or that they stopped giving because they did stop caring for me, you're wrong. First of all, and he's going to clarify this later on, Paul is, first of all, I'm not after them for their money. I'm going to clarify that later on, Paul says. But if you say that they stopped giving because they didn't want to give anymore, or they didn't want to support anymore, you're wrong too. Because these guys have the heart of cheerful givers. They're just waiting for the opportunity to give, even in their poverty. That's one way that Paul is trying to clarify what he said in the first part of verse 10, so that his words will not be misunderstood. Now, verses 11 to 13 also serves the purpose. Okay? He's also saying this to clarify what he said in verse 10, so that he won't be misunderstood, because some people, again, could read the first part of verse 10 and say, well, Paul is he's a prosperity preacher. All he wants is money coming from the Philippians. That's all he wants from them. He doesn't care about them. All he wants is to get their money. Is that true? Let's check out verses 11 to 13. And this first phrase that just answers the question, right? Not that I am speaking of being in need. Paul's saying, like, really, if you ask me, I don't even, I'm not even in need, right? So how can you say that I'm after their money if I'm not even in need? And then he qualifies that. He says, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. Right? How does he define contentment? Next verse. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. Okay? In any and every circumstance, I have learned. Okay? Know, learn. I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. And then we come to our verse. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So how does verses 11 to 13 prove that Paul is not some greedy, money-loving preacher? How does that prove it? Um, you want to know? Come back next week. We don't have much time this week. I'm already at 43, and plus we have a business meeting. So hopefully you're content with that. be, be happy with that. But what I do want you to do is continue to read. Keep reading those verses 11 to 13, and just meditate on it so that next week, you'll be more prepared to receive, um, you know, what I think, or in my studies, what I think this means when it comes to contentment. That's the key word here, is contentment. So hopefully you can come back next week. See you again next week. For now, we'll just close with a word of prayer.